And welcome into episode 63 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. It's been a while since we did a podcast, but as the world is slowly getting back to normalcy, we have all kinds of properties coming out from Marvel and DC and more. So we're going to start ramping things up again as we have a lot of information to digest. And in this edition of the podcast, I'm going to do my best to try to break down into a very digestible manner the announcements that came out from the Disney shareholders meeting that totally recalibrates the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe schedule for the next few years. At the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we'll have 13 properties coming out. Those are not just movies, those are Disney Plus shows coming out over the next several years. So let's open up a cold one, take a deep breath, and jump right in to episode 63 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So Disney had their end of year shareholders meeting where they made a ton of announcements because, for those who don't know, a lot of movies and television shows started doing production again during the fall, and they're actually getting things done at a breakneck speed because some of the locations that they're able to do filming and production at are places where there are still significant lockdowns and protocols going on because of the COVID pandemic. So as a result, a lot of shows and a lot of production is getting done, whereas on a normal schedule, it might have had a little bit more of a trouble getting things streamlined in certain locations, shall I call it. So as a result, during Disney shareholder meetings, they released the revamped schedule for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And the reason why we have to call it a revamp is two reasons. One, because Marvel missed an entire calendar year of production, of releases, of everything. So in my opinion, this comes as a blessing in disguise because this allows Marvel to really take the next step in full force to what the future is for the MCU in a world after Avengers Endgame. Remember, you had 10 years of stories and characters and basically universe building in order for us to get to this point. And now, because of Disney Plus and because Marvel has basically been handed a blank check by Disney and told, do whatever you want, we trust you. Kevin Feige, who is probably one of the most passionate people you would ever hear talk about Marvel Comics, he's out there basically with a blank check and without any real regulations. So we're going to see what this looks like moving forward as Marvel gets to dig very, very deep into their world from the last 50 plus years of comics. The second thing we have to take away from this is part of this change of schedule, part of this change of lineup is, I think, an opportunity for people to understand that there's a change of strategy at Marvel and Disney when it comes to their content. The Disney Plus platform has had way more success than anybody expected. Reports are they have over 89 million subscribers at this point. Those 89 million subscribers are just for Disney Plus. They're not for Hulu. They're not for ESPN Plus. So people are literally signing up just for Disney Plus at a breakneck speed in 12 months period of time. Disney projects to be able to break the 100 million subscriber mark in the next few months. And the idea is that with all the new Marvel content coming out, that should help them reach that goal and enticing more viewers. And as a result of the success of the Disney Plus platform, along with the movie industry taking a huge hit because of the pandemic and so many movie theaters closing down, what Marvel and Disney are doing is they are now going to use the movies for a totally different reason. The idea was originally that the movies would be the main attraction and that the movies would coerce people or entice them into signing up for Disney Plus for the Disney Plus shows that are all connected to the movies. Now, the strategy is different. The movies are now going to be a showcase for the content that is on Disney Plus and is going to serve as a bit of an advertisement to say, if you like this movie, you should go subscribe to Disney Plus. If you like this movie, you should make sure you watch all the content on Disney Plus. So the strategy has changed. It doesn't make the content any different, but it makes where their emphasis is just a little bit different. And that's why they had to realign this entire lineup. I'm going to start specifically explaining the Disney Plus shows really quick because I don't want to confuse anyone about what is going on, because the movie lineup has changed as well. And I will get to that in the next part of this, but I want to explain the Disney Plus television situation. If you have watched or haven't watched The Mandalorian in many ways was a test run for Disney Plus when it came to putting out content. Because what Disney Plus is trying to do with The Mandalorian wasn't just put out good content, but they were trying to see how quickly will audiences take to this type of production, which is their version of a Netflix series. And that's really what all of these Disney Plus shows are. They're all miniseries, self-contained miniseries, similar to, if you've ever read comic books, this is a self-contained story arc in comic books. Or, to use a different fictional realm, if anyone has ever read a series like The Chronicles of Narnia, or The Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter, each Disney Plus show is going to function as one book, okay? But you have to have all the books to keep the story going. So think about it that way. That's the style that is coming for these shows. And that's why it's so important to remember that everything is interconnected as I explain this. And as I said, I'm going to do my best to try to make this as digestible and simplified as possible. Down the road, we will review here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast every single show when it's done. We will review every movie as we have in the past. We're going to explain everything as we go along. So I want to start in chronological order. WandaVision is launching on Disney Plus January 15th. Now, this will be the first show. This was not originally supposed to be the first show, but it just happens to be the first show. The first thing you need to know about this show is more than just Wanda Maximoff and Vision returning and reprising their roles. This is a stage setter for future Marvel movies, specifically for the third Spider-Man movie and for Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness. And the reason that is because this show is going to get into reality warping and explaining what is going on in the world after Endgame when it comes to people who have been affected by the outcome of Endgame. Because remember, the two major things that happened in Endgame is, number one, Thanos destroyed the Infinity Stones in the primary MCU timeline. And then when the superheroes went back in time and grabbed the stones and then had to fight another version of Thanos from another timeline, they ended up creating a multiverse of possibilities when it comes to reality. So it seems like this show is going to be dealing with how Wanda, played by Elizabeth Olsen, is handling that, because we see her having this whole situation and this whole relationship and this whole life with Vision. Well, Vision was killed in Infinity War. So how could Vision be here in the present? That's the big talking point in the cliff note. The other thing that needs to be remembered is we will see the debut of the adult version of Monica Rambeau. Now, we saw the young child version of Monica in the 90s for Captain Marvel's movie. And the significance of that is Monica Rambeau in the comics is, as I've explained, a MacGuffin. A MacGuffin is a character that is brought in to say, nobody can beat this character except for this character, or nobody can be this powerful except for this character, or this situation or this character or this plot device can solve anything. So Monica Rambeau has been a ridiculously powerful character in the comics. So her making her debut in this show, along with a perception, looks like that there is a reason why Wanda is stuck in this bizarre sitcom style environment, is going to set up a lot of what we see in the movies moving forward. Because if we're dealing with reality warping and we're dealing with the multiverse, then obviously Wanda Maximoff's character, Scarlet Witch, has to be involved because of her powers. So that's all we really need to get into with that show. I don't want to dig too deep into it because trying to do much conjecture with that show at this point is very, very subjective. There's not a lot of objective information with that show because Disney's been very specific at keeping that show under wraps because of its relevance to the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The next show that's going to come out on Disney Plus is on March 19th, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. This was originally supposed to be the first show that came out on Disney Plus. This picks up with Sam Wilson's Falcon and Bucky Barnes immediately after the events of Endgame, where Captain America, old Captain America, hands his shield over to Sam Wilson and says, "You should have this." The trailer for Falcon and the Winter Soldier is very specific about what to expect from this show. This show is dealing with a world dealing with the fallout of Endgame. And part of the fallout of Endgame is Captain America is not there anymore. And the U.S. government, who technically has a property claim on the Captain America name and Captain America's shield and all the things that go with that, are going to interfere in things that is going to cause more problems that have to be solved later in the show. We are introduced to a couple different characters in the trailer, including a villain known as Flag Smasher, a very, very old school, but revamped for this show, Captain America villain that is very anti-nationalism, very anarchist. So Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes are going to have to work with some interesting people in order to take down Flag Smasher and their terrorist group. We are also introduced to the character of John Walker. John Walker is an individual who underwent a transformation via the super soldier serum, but it wasn't the original super soldier serum, it was a variation of it. But as Dr. Erskine explains in the original Captain America, super soldier serum brings out what's inside of you. And in the comics, John Walker, he's overly violent, he's overly aggressive, he has a ridiculous high level of macho to his personality. And in the comics, he does serve as a version of Captain America for a while, but then later has to give up the character in the comics and becomes a semi-hero / vigilante who works for the government, known as U.S. Agent. But in the trailer you see for Captain America Winter Soldier, you see him dressed as Captain America, similar to what happens in the comics. So it's pretty straightforward what we can expect from this trailer. The government doesn't like Sam Wilson being handed the Captain America mantle because they weren't involved. They're going to get this John Walker guy involved. He is somehow going to make things more complicated or worse for everybody dealing with this group of terrorists led by Flag Smasher. These anarchists have to be taken down. And in order to take them down, Sam Wilson and Bucky Barnes turn to a former enemy and turning him into an ally. Baron Zemo, who we saw was the primary catalyst villain in the movie Captain America Civil War. So we're going to see an interesting alliance going on, and it probably has something to do with Baron Zemo's past, because remember from Captain America Civil War, we learned that Baron Zemo had a background in counterterrorism, and he had a background as a intelligence agent for the Sokovian military. So he probably dealt with something that has to do with this show, and that's why the show ends up bringing him into the group to work with them. Also, we are supposed to be, according to reports, being introduced to the international haven known as Madripoor. Now, Madripoor in the comics is one of the few fictional locations in all Marvel Comics. It's Wakanda and it's Madripoor. Madripoor is an island nation located in the Pacific, somewhere around like Thailand, Vietnam, southern Japan. The city is patterned off of basically that region of the world. And the idea is there's the high city and there's the low city in Madripoor. It's a concept that has been played around with in comics for multiple things in the past, but the idea is the high city is where the rich people live and the low city is where the poor people live. And the high city, what's very relevant is that Madripoor is a neutral land for the criminal element to come and do their dealings, where they're not allowed to kill each other, they're not allowed to do anything to each other as long as they're in Madripoor. And Madripoor's government takes this rule very, very seriously. And there are concepts of Madripoor from the comics that were used for the movies John Wick. So if you remember John Wick going to those hotels where, no one's allowed to kill each other, there's no business done on property. Well, imagine there's an entire city like those hotels from John Wick. And Madripoor was created decades ago in the comics, mostly as a plot device to explain some of the things that Wolverine was doing in the comics. And that's why some people expect that Wolverine might be mentioned or suggested or maybe even introduced in this show. I don't think he'll be introduced because Marvel already has plans for an X-Men movie coming in a few years. And we'll get to that near the end of the podcast with the movie lineup rundown. But the purpose of the Falcon and Winter Soldier is to clean up the plots from Endgame while also explaining some of the things you're going to see in the Black Widow movie that's coming out. The other thing with the Falcon and Winter Soldier is to explain who the next Captain America is, which will eventually be Sam Wilson, just like it was in the comics when Steve Rogers chose Sam Wilson to be his successor. Same deal happened in the movie. It's a very predictable outcome, but it's going to be very interesting because they're going to introduce you to things and explain a lot of things that we're going to see in the future from both television shows and movies. The next television show on the slate in May of 2021, the TV show Loki. This is another show that is very straightforward and self-explanatory about what we are to expect. So if you remember in Endgame, in the past, when they altered the timeline, Loki stole the Tesseract instead of going to Asgardian prison. Okay, that whole situation went sideways. In the trailer for Loki's show, he ends up in the Mongolian desert. And we see in the trailer that after him landing in the Mongolian desert, he ends up in the custody of the TVA. Now, the TVA is basically time-traveling police. In Marvel Comics, in the very, very far future, an organization is set up to deal with people who are basically messing with the timeline because they can, or because they're irresponsible, or because they're trying to change reality as we know it. And this is probably going to be our first introduction to a villain that I have mentioned here on the Mutant Blitz podcast for the last 2 years that I told you was coming. I told you this 2 years ago that he was coming. Kang the Conqueror has been confirmed by Marvel that he is coming. And this is important because every time in the comics that time travel is dealt with, Kang the Conqueror is there. Now, there's going to be a huge variance with Kang the Conqueror from the comics that I'll get to a little bit later, but we are going to get our first glimpse of him because when Loki goes in the past, he does mess with some things. And we are introduced to Owen Wilson playing the character of Morbius, who is one of the top agents in the time variance agency that is handling time. And according to the trailer, basically, Loki starts getting involved in history and starts doing things in history. And it's suggested that there are things that have happened in world history that he is either altering or putting himself in place of, along the way, dealing with this shadowy character known as Kang the Conqueror. And according to the trailer, it looks like what happens is that the TVA explains to Loki, if you didn't take the Tesseract, this is what would have happened. And they show him what happened in the MCU for the last 6 years, from the Avengers movie to Thor Ragnarok, and kind of give him an idea of, this is your life kind of idea, you know. So, and the working theory is that because Loki has messed with the timeline, and because Avengers Endgame messed with the timeline, that Kang the Conqueror is now basically messing with the timeline back, okay? And another thing you have to remember is this show is going to directly set up 2 other movies. Loki is going to set up, as I mentioned, Kang the Conqueror is going to be the primary villain in the 3rd Ant-Man movie. Also, Kang the Conqueror is going to be basically a character that we're going to have to keep an eye on for a while now. We might see him pop up in some other places as well, aside from Ant-Man 3 and Loki, but he's definitely a huge part of explaining certain backgrounds of things. The other character that is going to show up in the Loki show, we're going to get a explanation for the other side of the Doctor Strange movie, which is time travel, creating a multiverse, being a different variation of different events, and there being a primary timeline and there being a multiverse. And Loki's role in all of that. It's going to be a fun show. I'm really looking forward to the Loki show, actually more than the other 2, because the show is really going to dig deep into the part of Marvel Comics that if you grew up reading comic books, you enjoyed, which was, you know, basically watching these supposedly strong, confident characters be put in situations that are completely outside their comfort zone and forcing them to sit there and say, okay, what do I do now? So I'm definitely looking forward to that a lot. Another Marvel show that's coming to Disney Plus is the show What If? What If is basically saying if there were different scenarios that happened in the world of Marvel Comics, like what if Peggy Carter got the super soldier serum instead of Steve Rogers? Or, what if Thor never was worthy again? Or, what if the Avengers didn't win in the first Avengers movie? Or, different scenarios through history that could have changed. That show is coming in 2021. That show's more of like an interesting side piece. This is kind of one of those deals where Marvel gets to have a little fun with characters and stories without having to do a ton of production, because the show is going to be basically a cartoon, basically. So that show is not as important to the other shows, but I thought I'd mention it because it's one of the 13 that were announced. Also in 2021, we are introduced to Miss Marvel. Kamala Khan is coming to Disney Plus. Now, Miss Marvel is a huge, huge fan favorite in the comic book community. She has a borderline cult following. And Kamala Khan in the comics, she's a 16-year-old Pakistani-American girl who grows up and is a huge fan of superheroes. She's a video gamer. She's an A+ student. She's just one of these, everyday kids. She loves superheroes. She admires Captain Marvel. But because of her family's background being Pakistani and because of the world she lives in, she has trouble fitting in with people. And along the way, she ends up getting superpowers. And the whole show is going to be about her getting her superpowers, her dealing with it, still trying to be a teenager. Who can she tell about her powers? Who can't she tell about her powers? All that kind of stuff. And the purpose of this show is, one, to introduce Miss Marvel. Two, to explain why she's going to be in Captain Marvel 2. That's right. She is going to be one of the characters that is going to be fighting alongside Captain Marvel in Captain Marvel 2. And we're also going to see that Miss Marvel is going to be a part of the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is you're introducing these younger characters now. Like Miss Marvel and She-Hulk and others that are going to slowly take the place of these older characters because, as we saw with Captain America, people do get old. And as we saw with Iron Man, people die. So, got to move on at some point, right? So, you're introducing a character that is very popular. She has, I got to believe, at least over 100 story arcs in the comics with almost every character in Marvel Comics. Miss Marvel is, like, do you remember, those of you who are older, it was at one point, it was, Murder, She Wrote and Magnum P.I. and all those shows in the 70s and 80s all appeared on each other's shows because they were all on the same network at one point. It's kind of like that, but on a larger scale. It's basically, she is a primary character that appears in everybody else's movies and shows. And everybody likes her. She's a little young and she's a little big-eyed in the moment, but she cares. She wants to do the right thing. She wants to help people. This is probably going to be one of the more heartwarming, fun shows on the Disney Plus platform, just because of her background and what she represents. It's basically, what if a kid who grew up loving superheroes became one herself? So it's a full cool idea, because Spider-Man, the idea is when Spider-Man was created by Stan Lee, there wasn't all these superheroes for him to admire and look up to. He grew up with the other superheroes. And even though they were adults and he was a kid, it was like, well, you're one of the originals. She's not an original. The idea with her is, what if superheroes have been around for like forever, and Spider-Man and Captain Marvel and everybody, but then you got powers too, and your powers are pretty impressive. So what do you do then? So that's going to be fun. Also in 2021, the Hawkeye Disney Plus show, which is almost done filming right now. They are getting done their production at a breakneck speed because of the lockdowns. They're able to do stuff in New York City right now with nobody around. They don't have to deal with half the problems they have to deal with filming and production. So the Hawkeye show is going to be Hawkeye's character, Clint Barton, teaming up with another well-known archer from the comics, Kate Bishop, who's going to be played by Haley Steinfeld. This is significant because this is a handing of the torch show. This is the original Hawkeye training the next Hawkeye. There's been a lot of suggestions that Marvel is going to have multiple Avengers teams moving forward, like they do in the comics, like the adult Avengers and the young Avengers. So this new Hawkeye and Miss Marvel and some other characters will be a part of that young Avengers group. And the young Avengers thing is not the most original thing in the world. I mean, Marvel Comics, DC Comics, they've been playing around with younger variations of heroes for decades in the comics, so this is not that strange. But the cool thing with this show is what you're going to see is basically a mentor Padawan one, kind of like Jedi Star Wars situation, except without the dark side and all that stuff going on. And this show is going to, like Miss Marvel is, she's being introduced to put her in future films. The new Hawkeye is being brought in to introduce her into upcoming films and storylines and such. We don't have a ton of information on the show just because of the fact that it's still in production, and let's not forget that Marvel has a lot of stuff going on before we even get to that point. But what we do know is whatever happens to Black Widow is going to have a direct connection to this show. This show will have a direct connection because the character we're introduced to in the Black Widow movie, Yelena Belova, played by Florence Pugh, is going to be in that show. So there is going to be some connective tissue from that movie to that show. Another show that's coming out that Disney is working on that they haven't announced a specific date for, but it's currently in pre-production, the She-Hulk show. I can't wait for this. They're finally going to bring She-Hulk to the MCU. First of all, this is long overdue. I knew there was a lot of red tape that had to do to get this show on because who had the rights to She-Hulk? It was a very big conflict for the last, I want to say, about 20 years. It was very ambiguous about who actually had She-Hulk because, for those, make a very long story short, when Marvel sold the rights to the Fantastic Four to Fox, previously they had sold the rights to the Hulk to Universal. The reason that's important is because under the contracts of the rights agreements for all the characters that eventually Marvel gave away, they've gotten almost all of them back now because of the 21st Century Fox studio purchase, there was this gray area about where does She-Hulk belong in the pantheon of comics? Because She-Hulk has a very long history with the Fantastic Four. So does she belong to, is that a Fox property? Then she has a very long history with the Hulk because Jennifer Walters' character in the comics is the Hulk's cousin. So does she belong to Universal? And then Marvel had a co-share agreement with Netflix for the Defenders shows for Daredevil, Luke Cage, all those characters. Well, She-Hulk has a long history with Daredevil. So does she belong to Netflix? So they had to wait until they got the 21st Century Fox studio purchase in order to finish cleaning up the legal rights to who owned what. And now that the Netflix rights are expiring, and that's why Charlie Cox can play Daredevil in the upcoming Spider-Man movie, they now can bring She-Hulk. And I love the fact that this is being labeled as a comedy series. This is perfect for Jennifer Walters because Jennifer Walters was one of a handful of characters in comics that broke that fourth wall. She would talk to the comic book reader. She would have this satirical attitude about things. She would joke with people. She would have these ridiculous comics because Jennifer Walters is arguably the greatest legal mind in all of comics. Okay? She's not just your everyday lawyer. She is a genius lawyer. She just happens to be able to Hulk out and kick some butt too. So this is a very exciting character to bring in. She's intelligent. This is going to be fun. I like the fact they're making it a comedy. Mark Ruffalo is going to reprise his character as the Hulk. He's going to have a lot of fun. I mean, this is going to be absolutely bonkers. So I'm excited for this. And also, She-Hulk is going to reestablish the Earthbound characters, basically. You know, the stuff that we saw in Netflix can now be brought to the Disney Plus platform. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Charlie Cox has been confirmed as being brought to the MCU because Charlie Cox, guess what he is? He's a lawyer. Jennifer Walters, she's a lawyer. They both are in New York. What a coincidence. Also, with the Fantastic Four movie coming, in a few years, we know that She-Hulk has a very long relationship with the Fantastic Four. The Spider-Man 3 movie, I wouldn't be surprised if she appears in that as well. So I am definitely looking forward to that show. Another Disney Plus show that's been announced is Moon Knight. Moon Knight is something that I am not going to spend a lot of time explaining right here and right now. Because number one, this show is 2 years away. Okay? I am not going to spend a ton of time explaining this. Basically, in the comics, Moon Knight was one of the characters that was introduced decades ago. That the idea with Moon Knight is he was part of a group of heroes that were all dealing with, the world of the occults and mysticism and, demons and angels and all that stuff. That whole world in the early 70s where it was characters like Blade and Dracula and Man-Thing and all these, bizarre characters from mythical history, Egyptian gods, Persian gods. Because in Marvel Comics, anyone who's ever been a god in world history, that's not Jesus Christ, for example, is considered an actual person in Marvel Comics. They are a lowercase god, but even though they were worshipped as an uppercase god. And in the Moon Knight show, there's a man named Mark Spector. He's a former CIA agent whose life is saved by the moon god. And the idea is that Moon Knight, when he is running around as Moon Knight, he has all the abilities of Mark Spector, the CIA agent, but he's way more powerful than that. And it's going to be played by Oscar Isaac, which is a cool idea. I like the fact that they got an actor who has experience playing interesting roles. You know, he played the Poe Dameron from the Star Wars movies. He also played a couple other roles that were interesting in the past. He played the character of Apocalypse in the X-Men movie. So he has a history of playing interesting characters already. And this is going to be probably the biggest task of his life, because Moon Knight is one of the most complex characters in all Marvel Comics. So while on one hand I'm interested, on the other hand, I'm not sure what to expect. Disney Plus is also going to have Secret Invasion in a couple of years. That is going to have Samuel L. Jackson reprising his role as Nick Fury. Story is Skrulls are shapeshifters. They're a race of shapeshifters. And the good Skrulls bring everybody up to speed that there are bad Skrulls who have infiltrated Earth for years, and now they got to go and stop them. That's it. That's all you need to know. Shapeshifters, Alien Invasion, television show, coming to Disney Plus in a couple years. That show probably will be less about setting up movies than it will be about cleaning up storylines. It'll probably have something to do with Captain Marvel 2. It'll probably have something to do with some aftermath of Doctor Strange into the Multiverse of Madness. Then you have the Ironheart show. Now, this is a show that, to be honest with you, I didn't expect to ever be made. I heard there were rumors about this, but I didn't think they were going to be made. Ironheart is a very new character in the last 10 years. A young lady named Riri Williams, who is a young lady who's a genius inventor, she builds her own Iron Man armor from scratch. And this show is going to be another one of these young characters that are presented for the future of the MCU as they bring in new, younger characters to slowly fill the void of the older characters who are going to move on. The idea of Ironheart is that this is basically the next Iron Man, but she doesn't have the money or the ego of Iron Man, but she has the equal level of intellect. And again, it's kind of like Miss Marvel. It's somebody who grew up with world superheroes, and now she's figured out how to be her own superhero, which leads directly into another TV show that's coming to Disney Plus, Armor Wars. This is going to be a storyline that follows up directly on Iron Man 2. The premise of Iron Man 2 is, what if the Iron Man technology fell into the wrong hands? And in this case, it does. And we're going to see the return of War Machine, played by Don Cheadle. That's going to be fun. I'm glad they're going to give him basically his own show at this point, because he deserves it, because he's done an incredible job with the character of James Rhodes over the years. And we're probably going to see a little bit of Riri Williams in this show too. And it's basically going to be them dealing with somebody who got their hands on Stark technology and they're using it for evil. That's all you need to know. And then a couple more Disney Plus shows that are coming. They don't need a ton of explanation either. You have Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. Straightforward, right? Guardians of the Galaxy characters, Christmas Special. That's all you need to know. James Gunn, good stuff. And then the final Disney Plus show is coming is I Am Groot. That's a show that we don't have a ton of information about, but what we do know is either right before or right after Guardians of the Galaxy 3, they're going to have this I Am Groot show. And as would it be explained, it has to do with that show, interconnectivity right there. So that's the Reader's Digest version of all the shows that are coming that were announced. I didn't want to spend a crazy amount of time explaining too many of the shows because we don't have a ton of information, and some of the information is kind of, fast and loose right now. But basically, to make a very long story short with the movies, and I'm not going to explain every movie either. I'm just going to do a very, very, very fast rundown of the order of the movies. Because again, as the movies get closer, we will review them. We will explain them. And as the TV shows come, we will review them and kind of fill in the blanks for you as we go along. The basic premise of the Marvel movies that are coming, as was announced in the meeting of the Disney shareholders, is they still have Phase 4 and Phase 5. They're still breaking these movies up. But the idea is they just happen to change the order of everything, okay? That's really what it's about. It's just about, recalibrating, changing things around, getting things in, a better explanation of what to expect moving forward. So, and part of the changes they had to make was because of the fact that with all the delays, they lost an entire year of production. They lost an entire year of building, of universe building and expansion. So here's basically the rundown of the movies starting May 7th, 2021. The Black Widow movie was supposed to come out in May 2020, is now moved to May 7th, 2021. As I mentioned before, this is a prequel for Avengers Infinity War. So we're going back in time to set up the future. Because as I mentioned, Yelena Belova, who is introduced in the Black Widow movie, will be in the Hawkeye television show. Also, we're introduced to the villain Taskmaster in this show. And I'm going to assume that Taskmaster has a larger implication on the MCU because they're going to use Taskmaster to basically explain certain things. Taskmaster, in the comics, for those who don't know, is one of the greatest villains in all of Marvel Comics. One of the most formidable. Taskmaster, aside from being an elite strategist and a chemically enhanced human being thanks to experiments by S.H.I.E.L.D., or maybe in this show it'll be by the Russians, because this apparently is all going on in Russia. Taskmaster's greatest ability is Taskmaster can copy anyone's fighting style and go blow for blow with anyone. In the comics, there's only a couple of people who can defeat Taskmaster. That would be Deadpool and Spider-Man, because neither one of them are predictable fighters. Otherwise, Taskmaster can beat anybody. So this is going to be a show that does a lot of groundwork. As I mentioned previously in the Mutant Blitz podcast, Phase 4 movies are all about setting up the future. So that's where Black Widow is going to be May 7th, 2021. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, July 9th, 2021. Another potential Young Avengers candidate. Shang-Chi is a master of the martial arts. He was created back in 1973 because the late 60s, early 70s television show Kung Fu that starred David Carradine was never supposed to star David Carradine. David Carradine filled a role because producers in Hollywood didn't think an Asian could be a lead star in Hollywood. It was a very different time in our world. Not going to get into it right now, but because people knew the story that Bruce Lee actually created the television show Kung Fu, but the producers stole his idea because they told him an Asian could never be a lead on a television show. People over at Marvel said, well, what if we basically took Bruce Lee and made him into a comic book character? And that's how the character of Shang-Chi came around. Now, Shang-Chi's relevance in what we're going to be seeing is the introduction, as in the title, the Ten Rings. Now, the Ten Rings are wielded by a very, very formidable villain known as the Mandarin. We were introduced to a false Mandarin in Iron Man 3, but thanks to fan outcry and Marvel telling people, please wait and see what's coming, we will get back to that plot point. They're going to, in this movie, and show you that there is an evil organization that's operating in Asia that is led by the Mandarin. And Shang-Chi is going to have some sort of uphill battle to deal with these villains and this evil organization. The Shang-Chi movie will probably have something to do with Falcon and the Winter Soldier as well, because remember, if you're going to be in Madripoor, which is in Asia, it probably has something to do with Shang-Chi. And Marvel is slowly expanding their universe. You know, Black Panther went to Africa, and Black Widow is going to Russia, right? And Captain America Civil War and Avengers Age of Ultron, they both went to Central Europe. So they're slowly covering more and more of the international map, and Shang-Chi is part of that. Shang-Chi is also a character who, in the comics, like Miss Marvel, teams up with a lot of people. So I would expect the character of Shang-Chi after this movie to be in a lot of other movies. November 5th, 2021, The Eternals is coming out. This is another thing I am not going to get heavy into right now because the explanation is going to make me exhausted and is probably going to cause a lot of you listening to this podcast out there to probably just stop listening. But the Eternals movie is basically going to clean up some of the information we saw from Avengers Infinity War and Endgame when it comes to cosmic and the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's also going to deal with the long-running war between the Eternals and the Deviants and the creation of mutants and the history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because in Marvel Comics, Earth as we know it in the Marvel was developed by a race of aliens called the Celestials. So, not going to spend a lot of time on that because, again, I will get exhausted and you will get confused. The third Spider-Man movie coming out December 17th, 2021. This is going to be dealing with multiple Spider-Man. It has been confirmed by multiple reports that Spider-Man will meet other Spider-Men. Okay? Remember, we're dealing with a multiverse now. So, Spider-Man is going to be mentored basically by Doctor Strange. He's going to have to deal with a world in which the world knows who Spider-Man is. We're going to probably have to deal with Charlie Cox's character, Matt Murdock, not just helping Spider-Man as Daredevil, but potentially helping Spider-Man as maybe his lawyer, defending Spider-Man in court because people think that he murdered Mysterio. If you go back to watch Spider-Man Far From Home, which is not what happened, but it was manipulated. People think it was that. And this is going to play a little bit on the comic books story arcs of the Spider-Man and Into the Spider-Verse, because there are reports that we are going to have Tom Holland's Spider-Man meet Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man characters. So it's also been suggested, because of the casting for this movie, that we are going to get a battle between Spider-Man and the Sinister Six. But it's going to be a unique Sinister Six from the multiverse, because we are supposedly going to have Jamie Foxx's Electro from Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield, and Alfred Molina's Doc Ock from Spider-Man 2 with Tobey Maguire, as well as William Dafoe reprising his role as Henry Osborn. So, a lot of stuff going on there. Moving on. Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness, March 25th, 2022. This is going to be the apex for Phase 4, because this is not just going to be basically a crescendo for a bunch of story arcs from Spider-Man and WandaVision and a bunch of other stuff, but this is also going to set up the future for why we are going to have the Fantastic Four, and why we're going to have the X-Men, and why we're going to have Deadpool, and why we're going to have all these characters. Because if I am understanding what Marvel is going to do properly, it seems like we are going to not have a permanent multiverse, but a shrinked multiverse. Like, we're going to have all these different planets, and then some of them are going to merge into each other at some point. Because I can't see Marvel constantly jumping from universe to universe all the time. But it seems like what they are doing is they're going to use Spider-Man 3 and Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness to basically explain away every other Marvel movie. So all the Sony Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, all the X-Men movies with Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and Halle Berry as Storm and James McAvoy as Professor X, and all those movies are basically going to be explained as they were existing in an alternate universe. And because of the aftermath of WandaVision and Avengers Endgame, the multiverse has become a mess, and Doctor Strange is here to attempt to save the day. And we're also be introduced to America Chavez, another modern fan favorite comic book character, a young lady whose powers include teleportation and flying and enhanced strength, I guess you can say. Yeah. Moving on. Again, lots to digest. I'm doing my best to summarize this the best I can. Thor, Love and Thunder, May 6, 2022. This is also going to be a movie that is going to set up a lot of what we see moving forward. We're going to see Guardians of the Galaxy appear in Thor, Love and Thunder. We are also going to be introduced to Lady Thor, which is Jane Foster, portrayed by Natalie Portman. And we are also going to be introduced to Christian Bale's debut in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, playing the supervillain Gore the God Butcher. Gore the God Butcher is probably one of the most anticipated villains for any comic book fan, because Gore the God Butcher is a super intelligent and vengeful character who basically blames the gods, lowercase g, as I mentioned earlier. There are gods all over Marvel, but they're not really God. They're just people who think they're cosmic entities, and they're actually just beings from a planet. But Gore is a person who lost his family and his mother, and all people died in his life, and he blamed the gods, quote unquote, for his family's struggles. So he goes on a venge tour to destroy and kill every lowercase g god in all of the multiverse. And he is going to be played by Christian Bale, which is exciting because Christian Bale is an incredible actor. And the idea with this film is that Chris Hemsworth playing Thor is going to reprise his role as this superpower being. He's going to rekindle his love with Jane Foster, and they're going to have to work together to stop Gore the God Butcher. So that should be fun. Black Panther 2, July 8th, 2022, is a movie that is completely different, and we have no expectations for, because we have been told by Marvel that they are not going to recast T'Challa, who is played by Chadwick Boseman, who passed away this year from complications from cancer. They're going to instead explore more of the characters from the previous film. So Shuri and Okoye and all those characters are going to be expanded upon, basically. And I'm going to assume that Shuri is going to become the next Black Panther in some way. That's kind of what the world is leaning toward. That's kind of what we're expecting. I'm not fully sure how they're going to do it. I know they hinted in Avengers Endgame about the presence of Atlantis. I personally would like to see Marvel go with the storyline that T'Challa is murdered by someone from Atlantis, trying to coax a war between Atlantis and Wakanda. Something along those lines that kind of makes sense for why Chadwick Boseman is no longer there. That's what I would prefer to see. I would like to see some sort of scenario where they cleanly explain why he's no longer Black Panther and open the opportunity for Shuri to become the next Black Panther. Also, it's an opportunity to bring Namor into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I would like to see them not make Namor a villain, because he's kind of like he plays both sides in Marvel Comics. So I would like to see them allow Namor to not be typecast too much, but we'll see what they do with that. Captain Marvel 2, November 11th, 2022. As I mentioned, this is going to be not just a sequel to Captain Marvel 2, but we are going to see Miss Marvel and Monica Rambeau make their movie debuts in this movie. There's also rumors that we are going to see Valkyrie work with Captain Marvel in this movie too. There's a lot of conjecture about who exactly the villain is going to be. I'm going to assume that it's going to be some sort of cosmic villain, because that's kind of what Captain Marvel is at this point. I'm not going to create a lot of conjecture from there, but just say that that's probably the direction they're going to go in. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 expected for 2023. This is going to be the direct follow-up of what happened to the Guardians when they go back into space after Avengers Endgame. This is also going to be a sequel to Thor, Love and Thunder in some ways. I'm also expecting this movie, because of what was teased in Guardians of the Galaxy 2, that we are going to see the character of Adam Warlock in this movie. Adam Warlock is a very controversial character in Marvel Comics. He was teased at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy 2, and anything James Gunn does, James Gunn follows up on. He never leaves any stone unturned. He never leaves any plot device unresolved later. He is famous for solving and bringing back everything. So I'm assuming that they're going to clean up that plot device, and they are going to have that have something to do with this movie. Also, we have Ant-Man 3, or its official working title is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. Basically, time travel, quantum realm, and your villain is Kang the Conqueror. That's all I really need to know. It's going to be fun. The Ant-Man movies are fun. Peyton Reed is back again to direct it and help film and do all this stuff. I'm very excited by the casting for the villain, Kang the Conqueror. It is going to be Jonathan Majors. Jonathan Majors is one of those guys who's just a really, really good actor. Okay, top notch. I expect him to knock this role out of the park. Kang the Conqueror is basically going to be reprised. So the MCU changed from the comics. In the comics, Ant-Man created Ultron, and Kang the Conqueror is a descendant of Tony Stark. I guess they're going to invert it. So I guess in this scenario, Kang the Conqueror is a descendant of Hank Pym, and Ultron is already a creation of Tony Stark. So I'm just going to assume they're just going to flip the script on that plot device. The idea of Kang the Conqueror is he's not just a descendant of these super geniuses, but he uses their technology to take over the multiverse centuries in the future. And the idea that Kang comes back into the past has something to do with the fact that they undid something in the present, and it'll be Ant-Man, it'll be Wasp, it'll be everybody working together to defeat him, and it'll be a fun time because the Ant-Man and Wasp movies are always a fun time. The other movies that Marvel has announced that are coming, but they don't have dates on them yet, include the Fantastic Four, which is going to be directed by John Watt. The significance of that is John Watt is currently the director and man in charge of guiding the Spider-Man movies with Tom Holland. So I'm going to assume there's going to be some sort of connected tissue from Spider-Man 3 to Fantastic Four movie. Also, don't forget, as I mentioned earlier, She-Hulk is affiliated with the Fantastic Four, so she will probably have something to do with this movie as well. Fantastic Four deal with a lot of different things, mostly cosmos and multiversal, so they go in a lot of directions with this movie, and I'm going to make no assumptions except for cross my fingers and hope that we get, at some point, Franklin Richards in the MCU doing crazy stuff, because the Jonathan Hickman run on the Fantastic Four is incredible, and his explanation and kind of tying up loose ends of the Fantastic Four's history of the last 50 years in comics with Franklin Richards is awesome. And if we can get that story anywhere close to the movies, that movie might outdo Avengers Endgame. I'll just leave it at that. Finally, they have announced they are going to come out with an X-Men movie. This movie is probably 4 or 5 years away. And it's not because they have a lot on their plate, which they do have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of stories to come before the X-Men movie comes along. But the other reason is Marvel seems to want to clean up storylines before creating new ones. And I appreciate that. I think that's very smart. I don't judge them for that. So before they get to the Fantastic Four, before they get to the X-Men, they're trying to finish other loose ends, storylines, plot devices, everything else. So I do appreciate that. And also Marvel has announced that one of their projects at some point is going to be the Blade movie. We don't know 100% a lot about that either, but we do know that Marvel's already cast a new Blade. We also know that in the comics, Blade has a lot of affiliations with various people, from Doctor Strange to the Hulk to Shang-Chi to Wolverine. So the idea is that we're probably going to get Blade, Fantastic Four, and X-Men all around the same time. So that might not even be phase 5. That would probably be like phase 6 or something, or whatever they're going to call it at that point. And Blade will probably have some direct or indirect connection to Moon Knight, I'm going to assume, because Moon Knight deals with an Egyptian god, and technically Blade is dealing with vampires and other occult stuff. I know Marvel's going to make it because all of these characters have had relations to each other at some point or another. So again, that's my working assumption with Blade. We don't have a lot of information about it though. So that is an explanation and the new lineup for the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. I tried my best to make it a Reader's Digest, a nice summary of everything, because when Marvel announces 13 TV shows and recalibrates an entire movie lineup of 10 plus movies in one reading, I needed to take a week to digest it all and explain it to everybody. So as these shows come out, as these movies come out, we will get more into them. But that is a summary and an explanation of what Marvel is doing moving forward. I'm Josh Hennig. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh Hennig. You can hit that like button below and subscribe to the podcast. This is where you get all of my shows. So whether it's Game Night on 97.3 ESPN, whether it's me filling on different shows on 97.3 ESPN, or me talking about comic books, movies, and television shows, you can get it all here on this YouTube channel. This is the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I appreciate you subscribing. I appreciate you listening, and I'll catch you next time.